Hello, my name is Georgina Rose. I'm a part-time esoteric content creator and part-time surfer of the Enochian Aethers. And welcome back to the Darling YouTube channel. On this channel, we discuss everything related to magic, mysticism, and everything on the fringe of esoterica. And in this video, I'm actually going to be kind of revisiting something that I had a conversation about years ago. So for those who've been around for a while, this channel really started as a Thelema channel. I was a very committed Thelemite for the vast majority of my occult life. Now, I do still consider myself a Thelemite, but I explore other ideas as well. I've gotten, increasingly more syncretic as my path has gone on, and I've delved a lot deeper into things like planetary magic and paganism, but Thelema is still a big part of my practice. I learned so much when I was completely committed to Thelema, and now Thelema's a big impact on me. And, now that it's been some time, I think it is time for me to talk about the biggest lies about Thelema. And since I am not solely talking about Thelema, I don't feel like I have that bias clouding me where I'm gonna softball things, because most people talk about Thelema online really do softball it, or there are people who hate Thelema and think Thelema is wholly bad and evil and Crowley bad and all that nonsense. So these are things that I've observed and I've learned. And actually years ago I made a video called The Biggest Misconceptions About Thelema, which I've since taken down because honestly, I was kind of stating the obvious in that video. This video is actually going to have some hot takes and actually be a bit controversial, so fight about it in the comments, I guess. Without further ado, let's get into it. So the first thing that I want to talk about, and the first lie, is that you can learn all of Thelema by just reading Thelema. That's not true. Thelema exists as a product of what it came out of. Now, I'm not saying some stupid nonsense like, oh, Thelema's a product of its time, Thelema's outdated, Aleister Crowley problematic. No, I don't think Thelema's outdated. If anything, I think Thelema was ahead of its time, honestly. But what I am saying is you can't understand Thelema without understanding what it comes out of. And I think in esoteric circles, we really do a disservice to our learning by just learning things as isolated traditions and not understanding that it's an entire canon of Western mysticism that we are looking at. If you're a Wiccan, you need to look at what came before Wicca. And if you're a Thelemite, you need to look at what came before Thelema, because Crowley didn't just come up with all of it. Of course, Crowley sort of radically revolutionized esotericism, but he didn't just make everything up, right? So much of what is taught in Thelemic material comes from what's ahead of it. And so when we're looking at the time period that Thelema is from, we need to look at, the OTO. What was the OTO? The OTO was a lodge magic group, and the lodge magic groups really existed during this period of time from the 1880s to about the 1950s, known as the Magical Revival. So the Magical Revival happened kind of right after the Enlightenment, that time when reason, logic, rationality, and ideas like egalitarianism really took form. And then after that, as what happens after every single movement of rationality, there's sort of a swing back towards spirituality. There's a continuous historic cycle of reason becoming big and then mysticism becoming big, and the occult revival is that swing the other way. But they did hold some Enlightenment ideals in the Magical Revival. So it was interesting because it was the first resurgence in a long time that was a spiritual revival that wasn't Christian. And so ideas like spiritualism, theosophy, Hermeticism, Neoplatonism really took form during this time, and Crowley wasn't at the start of that movement, right? Hermeticism and theosophy had already started really forming. And so you need to understand Thelema as something that was a little later in that movement, and thus every influence from that comes into Thelema. And I think it's a lie to believe that you can only read Crowley and understand everything. I think you need to look a little bit further back and look at Levi, look at A.E. Waite, look at the Golden Dawn, even look at Theosophy to understand sort of the collective consciousness and the zeitgeist of the time Thelema came from, to understand then what Crowley was saying and why Thelema was revolutionary. The lie about Thelema really refers to the American Thelema scene, and that is that Thelema is Crowleyan. Okay, hear me out on this. So a big problem within Thelema is people just trying to be Aleister Crowley. And I think that's especially more pronounced in European Thelemite communities. In the US, you want to know it's this really funny thing, because the people don't even realize they're doing this. And I was actually having a conversation with Amateur Magus about this the other night. American Thelemites think they're being Crowley, but what they're really being is Parsons. So if you're a Thelemite in the United States, the Thelemic lodge system in the US is heavily influenced by Parsons, and generally I think Parsons resonates a lot with kind of the American mind, because we are a very individualistic culture. And so the thoughts of Jack Parsons, one of the kind of later Thelemites, is really the basis of a lot of American Thelema, and why I think some of the toxic things in Thelema, like the heavy hedonism, has caught on so much. So Jack Parsons, he was around in the 1940s. He was a rocket scientist, and he was very powerful in the Thelema scene. He actually went off and had all these visions in the desert and essentially like wrote a 4th chapter to the Book of the Law, which is the holy text of Thelema. He had some good schizo visions, and he really changed everything. And he also put the divine feminine much more in the forefront in Thelemic stuff. As well, a lot of the weird political beliefs Thelemites come up with are from Parsons, because Parsons actually talked about politics. Crowley had the most incoherent politics of anyone alive. He was left-wing one day, right-wing the next day, couldn't decide what he wanted to do, whereas Parsons was pretty consistently kind of libertarian-y. So you get a huge Parsons influence on American Thelema. Dave actually was saying like all Thelema now is Parsonite Thelema, and I wouldn't agree with that, but I would say a large swath of American Thelema is actually downstream of about Thelema, is that Thelema is some spooky, scary religion, and of course that's a basic misconception, but the way I'm going to explain how it's not is what's interesting. So Thelema is a solar religion, okay? Thelema is a sun cult, which ironically, Christianity is also a sun cult, and so that's a good thing to chew on. Much has been written about that parallel. But yes, Thelema is all about the sun. Thelema is a sun worship group. Now, there is an outlier to this, and that is also worth bringing up, called Typhonian Thelema. So Typhonian Thelema was created by this guy, Kenneth Grant, who was one of the students of Thelema, and he actually went off in his whole other direction, and really took it in a more antinomian, left-hand path, lunar, Saturnian type direction. He really went into his own sort of thoughts on it. He wrote a lot about like dreams and different like understandings of Kabbalah. Typhonian Thelema is really its own beast. At this point, I don't really see how it's Thelema. You'll notice this thing consistently with Thelema where people like study Thelema for a really long time and then they go off and do their own thing with a Thelemic foundation. And I think the reason why that happened, and it's actually kind of happening to me currently, is Thelema, since it pushes true will so much, I think many people realize their true will is not just Thelemic rituals, and they end up like maintaining a core Thelemic philosophy and then going off and magically experimenting and doing something else. And also to mention about Typhonian Thelema, Kenneth Grant was very close to A.O. Spare, or Austin Osman Spare, the sexiest occultist. I should cut that. Austin Osman Spare was bad. Just gonna leave that there. But Austin Osman Spare did a lot of automatic writing and drawing, and he really was the predecessor to what we know now as chaos magic. Of course, Peter Carroll and Phil Hine are who people cite for modern chaos magic and like sigil work, but wouldn't exist without A.O. Spare. And so Typhonian Thelema and chaos magic have a lot of like interesting intermingling with each other. But yeah, Typhonian Thelema is not a solar cult, but mainline Thelema absolutely is. And what does the sun represent? The sun represents nobility, virtue. I mean, most right-hand path religions are solar. So that's like a very interesting thing that I don't think a lot of people realize early on. Thelema's like literally an upright solar cult. Shocking after Crowley's branding of it, but that's the truth. So this is not as brought up in modern Thelemic conversations, but it actually is important to understand where Thelema is coming from. And once again, we've got to look at the Magical Revival. So during the Magical Revival, we are post-Enlightenment. We are post the Age of Rationality and Reason. And of course, going back to spirituality after a period of reason, right? People aren't going to just like hard swap and reject all of reason. I mean, of course, some movements do that, but the Magical Revival wasn't interested in that. In fact, they thought they were building upon it. I mean, obviously they actually weren't, because I don't think the superstitious and the rational square as well as they were thinking it would, but a big idea of the time was metaphysics as an extension of science. And I mean, if we're going to get historic about it, like, let's be real, for most of history, metaphysics and science were heavily linked. That disconnect came much later. Like, if you look way back, like, the entire invention of mathematics was to track the movement of Mars in the ancient Middle East. I mean, alchemy and medicine are neck and neck for most of history. Now, they did detach at a certain point, especially as like modern scientific ideas came to the forefront and science became increasingly atheistic, and you were seeing more and more atheists coming into science and less devoutly religious people, which for a lot of history, I mean, science was a religious thing. I mean, religion and public life were more intermixed in so many ways, and that did affect science. But what was interesting about the Magical Revival is they weren't saying like necessarily it was an extension. And I mean, they were saying that, but that wasn't all they were saying. They were essentially saying, and this is the thing that Thelema does a little differently than even traditions like Theosophy that claim they are a science, is the way Thelema asserts that it's a science is that you can use the method of science to get the aim of religion. And the scientific method is the approach in which we go at science, right? You probably learned it in school, right? I learned it in school 8 million times. You get the hypothesis, you test it against a control, right? Essentially, Thelema, specifically the AA, an organization within Thelema, definitely wanted to do this with magic. And ironically, the people who ended up doing that were the government in a very messed up thing called MK Ultra, which was really bad. Thelema did not cause that, by the way. Please don't go conspiratorial on this. But basically they thought they could prove magic. And this was a big thing with the AA, and the whole idea of having a magical record where you talk about your experiments with magic. That is a big part of what Thelema was. Now, do I see that now? No. I do think some Thelemites bring up scientific illuminism, which is the term for this concept sometimes, but I don't think that's held because I don't think I don't think the modern occult movement is really interested in this idea. I think this is very much an idea that was of that time. I don't see people now doing that. In fact, I see most people who are interested in mysticism kind of being anti-science, kind of having a problem with the way science is treated like a religion. I don't see this idea as common. I mean, it is an intriguing one. I certainly think if we could say understand all of science, we would probably see metaphysics being proven true, but this is kind of an interesting thing of its time. Now, I have met some people who, still practice scientific illuminism, and that's cool. I mean, keep it alive. That is a core part of the tradition, but... So the next thing I want to bring up relates to the Aon of Horus. So if you read the Book of the Law, you read anything Crowley, he talks extensively about how there's going to be an Aon of Horus. We are in the Aon of Horus, as he says. He believes the Aon of Horus began when the Book of the Law was channeled. Now, Thelema believes in this idea called Aeonic succession, which is a non-linear version of time, where essentially there are these metaphysical ages that represent how religion changes over time. Now, this idea is pretty common in esoteric traditions. I mean, as I started looking more and sort of going more towards perennialism, I noticed this was a big staple in all perennialist writings, this idea of a cyclical time. The first religion that we know of that really brought this up was the Hindus. The Hindus have the yugas. According to Hinduism, we are in the Kali Yuga. Essentially, in the Hindu system, they're increasingly deteriorating. Now, in the Thelemic system, they are not increasingly deteriorating, but if you look at the meaning of the Thelemic ages versus the meaning of the Hindu ages, I mean, they overlap like crazy. As well, the astrological idea of the age of Aquarius kind of matches. I mean, I would say, and I'm going to be real, I think the Aeon of Horus, the Kali Yuga, the age of Aquarius are all the same thing. It's basically just, are you a pessimist or are you an optimist about it? Because what do these three things represent? Collapse of the old order, period of chaos and readjustment, war and intensity, passion. They're very choleric. They're all very martial and fiery, except for the age of Aquarius, which is Saturnian. So I guess that one doesn't apply to that. But generally, the idea in all of these is the current societal order, typically referring to Christianity, is going to collapse or diminish in society, and something new, something from the fringes is going to take over, and we will enter into a new age, right? All of those ideas essentially mean that. Now, of course, the Kali Yuga, it's very pessimistic, right? The Kali Yuga is a dark age. The Kali Yuga is bleak. But at the end of the Kali Yuga, what happens? That level of collapse sort of fixes the problems of society, and then it circles back to a golden age. Now, the Aeon of Horus is a fire and fury age as well. I mean, if you look at the Book of the Law, what chapter is associated with the Aeon of Horus? It's Ra Horquit. If you have read the Book of the Law, you read the Nuit, Hadith, and then the Ra Horquit chapter, it's oh my God, that's a jump. But Crowley saw this as optimistic. He thought this collapse of the old order into something new was going to be this beautiful process, even if it was intense and scary for a while. So same idea, different view. Now, Age of Aquarius is more neutral. It's just kind of stating the facts like most of astrology. You can take the Age of Aquarius in a good or a bad way. I actually recently did a Twitter thread about the Age of Aquarius and Pluto moving into Aquarius and what that means. And some people were horrified by that thread, and some people thought it meant this is my time to shine, right? This is when everything goes my way. So these are all just different ways of looking at the same general trend. It circles back to my first point, but let's be real. If you want to understand Thelema, you actually need to look at what came after. As I mentioned, there's a really common trend of people being Thelemites, learning a lot about Thelema, and then starting something new or extending Thelemic thought. I think the biggest problem in Thelema, and this is the one that everyone talks about, is that everyone just wants to be Crowley. New Thelemites like Crowley. They think he's cool. They listen to the Ozzy Osbourne song, and they're literally me. He's literally me, and want to be Crowley, right? That is not a good way to approach your spirituality at all. And a good way to not do this is to consider what came after Crowley. I do not think you should solely leave Crowley. Now, I do not think this means you should remove Crowley. There was this whole thing called post-Thelema a while back where this guy wanted to take Crowley out and start a new Thelema, and obviously that doesn't work. I mean, Crowley's an important thought leader in Thelema. You can't get rid of the guy. I mean, at that point, why are you still calling yourself a Thelemite, right? But looking at what came after is important, right? Thelema is not just Crowleyism, and if it was, that would suck and be lame and not very good, because Crowley did not complete his system. I genuinely believe Thelema, just as Crowley written it, is an incomplete system. Yes, of course, you can do a lot of initiations, but there are certain things in the human experience and certain parts of spiritual development that he simply couldn't do, and that's because he's a human. I mean, no person in one lifetime can, like, solve spirituality and solve religion. I don't think that's possible, especially since Crowley's just a man. He's not like Jesus. So looking at his successors, and even looking at traditions like Wicca or traditional witchcraft that came off him, can give you insight into what Thelema can be and what your practice can look like. Because, like, just in a quick version, the things that came off of Thelema are, like, Wicca, traditional witchcraft, chaos magic. I mean, really everything in modern occultism is a successor of Crowley-type Thelema. And I think we should all look at that and not rigidly box ourselves into Crowleyism. And I think I see people really, like, forcing themselves to do that, to, like, hang on to the label of Thelemite. And if that is not the least Thelemic thing in the world, I can't think of anything else. So don't is, like, really cool and satanic. I mean, it's not cool to be satanic, but you know what I mean, that Thelema's edgy and dark. And I mentioned that earlier with one argument against it. I've got a second one. Actually, Thelema had an idea called the Black Brothers. So Crowley and a lot of Thelemites really fixated on this idea of, like, evil initiates, evil black magicians coming after us, they're bad. That idea actually exists in Thelema, and people don't talk about it that much unless they're insulting someone on Discord or in an article, right? They're like, oh, you're a black brother. They throw it like libel. And I don't like the way it's used as libel. I think that's silly. But the idea of black brothers is interesting because generally, historically, in magic systems, there is, like, a term for, like, the bad occultists, the bad magicians, people we don't want to be. Often that's been words like maleficia, goetia, even witch, right? Now, we don't see witch like that now, but what I'm saying is Thelema has a concept of, like, bad magicians that we disagree with. And so Thelema has a very clear concept of evil because of this, and a very clear concept of an evil adept who is bad. And that's something that's just not talked to people, and people don't realize that until they're pretty deep in. So just letting you know now, the Black Brothers are seen as bad in Thelema. You don't want to be them, and they exist, showing that there's actually a pretty clear moral code in Thelema, because what is Thelema? It's a solar religion. What is the sun? Like, let's be real. Nobody sees it, but it's there. It's blatant. At this point, I wouldn't call it a lie. I'd say it's a half-truth, and that would be the idea that Thelema is male-centric. So a lot of people talk about, like when they're criticizing Thelema, they specifically talk about it from, like, a pro-woman standpoint, where they're like, oh, Thelema is male-centric. And the reason for this, and the grain of truth for this, is Crowley, when he was coming up with the progression of a magician within Thelema, basically what happens is there's eventually this part called the Scarlet Woman, and the Scarlet Woman is an office that women sort of inhabit, and the Scarlet Woman functions as a gatekeeper to Dot, or the Abyss, and the City of the Pyramids and all of this. And so by interacting with the Scarlet Woman, who is sort of an incarnation of Babylon, you get thrown into the Abyss, and then the Abyss is the test of the soul, and then out of that you come an epistemiss, and you're, like, enlightened in all of this. So a lot of people have a huge problem with this because the Scarlet Woman is pictured as female, and the magician is implied to be male. Now, I don't actually think this is necessarily bad, because let's be real, like, Crowley was a man, and most Thelemites are men, so of course the system's gonna be mostly about men. Like, it's a way overwhelmingly male system. I mean, that's kind of what happens. Now, the truth of it is it does make it a little strange as a female adherent. I don't think this should mean women should stay away from Thelema or Thelema bad. No. But I do think if you are a woman and you start progressing in Thelema, you kind of do need a different path of development. And that's why later Thelemites and people who come after Thelema are so interesting. Like, Gardner has a very female-centric system. I mean, there have been people like Templum Abyssi, which is like a divine feminine Thelemic organization that have done a lot of, like, they're literally like a female-centric group. So for women sort of interested in the path, they elaborate on that. I think it's one of those things where Crowley, I mean, if we're just talking about Crowley and Thelema, yes. But if we're talking about all those contemporaries that I would consider broadly part of Thelema, I would say no. Now, of course, as a woman, your path is different in any system, though. I mean, there's this weird idea now that men and women are supposed to have, like, the exact same spiritual path. They're not supposed to have different experiences, and that's, of course, silly. Like, even within Wicca, which I would say is one of the most pro-female systems, one of the most overwhelmingly female groups, like a Wiccan priest and a Wiccan priestess have different paths. And that's just because of the balance of the divine feminine and divine masculine. Like, that's just kind of how it goes. And there are some systems that are much more neutral if that is really something you're looking for, if you're very uncomfortable with this stuff. I mean, things like chaos magic, right? And certain pagan systems are much more neutral in that regard, but I don't think having like a male and female path is like necessarily a bad thing. I think it honestly kind of makes sense. It's just a shame Crowley didn't dive more into the female perspective and dive more into the path of the woman. But you know, that's what modern occultists can do, right? We can elaborate, because once again, occultism and esotericism is a living tradition. People have been making new forms of that tradition since the beginning of it. It's meant to be continuously evolving. And if we want more female based paths, I mean, we need to make those. We need to have those initiations, and we need to contact the spirits ourselves. Why is that Thelema's growing the fastest where Crowley's from? No, I actually, in my, I mean, I don't have like stats on this. I think Thelema's actually growing the fastest in Brazil. I mean, there's a lot of Brazilian Thelemites. Like, I've interacted with a lot of them online. I actually think Brazil is perhaps one of the most important places on earth for Thelema, and I think a lot of people just don't realize that. Like, after this guy Moda went to Brazil and really spread his teachings, like, there's a very strong Brazilian Thelemic kind of group, and there are some people within that who are really mixing like some Brazilian traditions and Thelema in very interesting ways. So yeah, Thelema has expanded its roots in so many interesting ways, and I just think that's something people don't realize when they're new, because I didn't realize this till I got on the internet and started posting, and then I was like, oh my god, there's so many people in Brazil who are Thelema. The last lie about Thelema is that being a Thelemite is exclusively following Thelema. Wrong. Brr. I wish I had like one of those buttons, like a wrong button. So many people, and this is within the Thelema community, push that like to be a Thelemite is to, you know, do these specific initiations, to follow only this, and they'll really go after you if you disagree with this. But the thing is, Thelema was defined to be open-ended. Thelema is just about true will. I mean, of course there are ritual stuff that go with that, and there are things that logically follow that, and some ideas you have to accept. But at the end of the day, Thelema is a very open-ended term, and not everyone likes that. I mean, there's a lot of pushback against that, because some people say, oh, it's gotten too open. But at the end of the day, like, it was kind of created to be open, and look at all the various things that came off it that are like real post-Thelemic, not like post-Thelemas in your internet cult, like actually post-Thelemic ideas. So yeah, I mean, I think Thelema is a loose definition. Not everyone likes that I say this, but I think so. I think if you don't want that, then make your own version. You wanna know what we could do? Okay. The people who want Thelema to be a really rigid definition, how about we create Orthodox Thelema? Orthodox Thelema is when you join my order and you do these initiations and you only read Crowley forever. Okay? Orthodox Thelema, just passed you guys this on the through the screen, okay? But Thelema's open-ended, and of course some people disagree with that, and if you call yourself a Thelema and you're Thelemite and you're like me and you practice a lot of different things, I mean, okay, sure, say what you want. People can think whatever they want, right? It's free speech, but yeah, I mean, I think Thelema is very open-ended because Thelema was intentionally defined to be open-ended, and I don't know, call Crowley on the Ouija board and take it up with him, really. So that's all I have to say. These are some kind of things that I learned about Thelema later on, some surprising things. And yeah, I mean, I haven't talked about Thelema in a bit. I talk about Thelema a lot less because I'm doing a lot more with my practice than just Thelema now. And I want to talk about those topics as well. But I hope this was helpful, and I hope this gave you some insight into what Thelema is and what Thelema can be, and got you thinking and got you reading outside of Crowley. So yeah, if you want to support me, you can get an extra video every month through Patreon. You get a ritual guide every month, and if you're high enough tier, you can do mentorship with me as well. I sell tarot readings. I'm currently doing a limited number of 2025 year ahead readings. You have to email me to book that. And I think that's everything. You can donate directly through Ko-Fi, and you can find me on Instagram, Twitter, Telegram, Substack, Threads. Oh, and I host a podcast, I post Modern Iconoclast on Spotify and on here. And I'm under the username .darling, by the way. All right, bye!